My brother mocked me at a family gathering for being broke until he learned I signed his promotion letter. There are moments that crystallize everything, when years of resentment and carefully maintained appearances collide in a single breath. For me, that moment came over my mother's famous meatloaf on a rainy Sunday evening. "There she is," my mother called as I stepped through the front door. "Harper's finally arrived. Everyone can relax now." I was running late. My ancient Honda Civic had protested the entire drive to my parents' suburban home, the wipers squeaking against the windshield like they were begging for retirement. By the time I pulled up to the curb, the driveway already occupied by my brother's gleaming Audi, my hair had frizzed beyond salvation, and my vintage cardigan bore a coffee stain I'd failed to notice earlier. My brother's eyes flicked up to meet mine, his smile widening to reveal perfect teeth that had cost our parents a fortune in orthodontist bills. At 34, Nathan had the polished look of someone who belonged in corporate brochures, crisp button-down with sleeves rolled precisely to mid-forearm, designer watch glinting under the chandelier, hair expensively cut to appear effortlessly styled. The dining table was already set with the good china, the kind reserved for holidays and promotions. My father was pour wine, while my Aunt Margaret fussed with dinner rolls. And there, at the head of the table where he'd positioned himself despite it being our parents' home, sat Nathan. Well, the artist finally graces us with her presence," he said, raising his wineglass in mock salute. "We were about to send out a search party." "Your brother's been telling us about his big news," my mother said, ushering me toward the empty chair. Nathan leaned back, arm draped around the shoulders of his wife, Elise, who smiled with the vacant pleasantness of someone who'd learned to fade into her husband's spotlight. "Big news?" I echoed, accepting the glass of Cabernet my father silently offered. "Just a little promotion," he said, his humility as authentic as the vintage cardigan I'd bought at Target last month. "VP of Strategic Operations at Centauri. Phillips called me into his office Friday, said the board's decision was nearly unanimous." "That's wonderful," I said, because it was the expected line in this familiar script. "Congratulations." Thank you, he waved dismissively. "It's not official until next week, but basically a done deal. Just waiting for the signatures from upstairs." He tapped his glass with his wedding ring. "I'm thinking of using the signing bonus to put in a pool. What do you think, Dad?" The Jensen property value went up 30% after they installed theirs. My father nodded approvingly as my mother emerged from the kitchen, triumphantly carrying her meatloaf on a serving platter. "Perfect timing," she beamed. "Special dinner for special news." As she placed the platter on the table, Nathan turned his attention to me, eyes gleaming with something I recognized all too well. The look that said, "Your turn in the spotlight, little sister, and we both know what's coming." "So Harper," he said, accepting an enormous helping of meatloaf from our mother, "still doing that, what do you call it? The artsy consulting thing?" Right. He nodded as if trying to remember something trivial. "For those little startup places, the ones with the bean bags instead of office chairs?" "Creative strategy direction," I corrected, keeping my voice light. "And yeah," Aunt Margaret chuckled. "Your sister always was the creative one in the family." "The creative one," Nathan repeated, as if translating from a foreign language. "That's one way put it. Tell me, sis, how's the pay and creative strategy direction these days? Economy's been rough on the arts, from what I hear." I felt everyone's eyes shift to my coffee-stained cardigan, my drugstore lipstick, the unmistakable signs of what they perceived as financial struggle. "Of course you do," Nathan nodded, his voice dripping with fraternal concern. "But seriously, if you ever need help making rent or want a real job with benefits, I'm going to be building out my team at Centauri. Could probably find something entry-level for you. Healthcare, 401k, the grown-up stuff. I manage," I said simply, cutting into my meatloaf with deliberate precision. The table erupted in appreciative laughter, even my father's eyes crinkling with amusement. Only Elise had the decency to examine her plate with sudden interest. "That's thoughtful," I replied, the words tasting like copper on my tongue. "But I'm comfortable where I am." "Comfortable is relative," Nathan shrugged, sharing a knowing look with our father. "Some people are comfortable eating ramen in a studio apartment. Others have bigger ambitions." "Nathan," my mother scolded without conviction, "stop teasing your sister. Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world." They didn't know, not about the penthouse overlooking the river. Not about the investment portfolio that had quadrupled since I'd quietly sold my stake in Bytestream. And certainly not about the board seat I'd insisted on as part of the acquisition deal. The one that placed me several levels above my brother in the corporate hierarchy he so revered. True, he conceded, raising his glass again. We need the dreamers too. They make the rest of us look practical. Another wave of laughter rippled around the table. I felt something shift inside me, not the familiar burn of humiliation that had accompanied these dinners for years, but something cooler and more calculated. 6 years ago, I would have defended myself, tried to explain the reality of my life to people who had already decided what it must be. Now, I simply smiled and took a deliberate sip of wine. You know what? I said, setting down my glass. You're right, Nathan. Not everyone is cut out for corporate life. It takes a certain perspective. Something in my tone made him pause, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before his confidence reasserted itself. Most importantly, Nathan didn't know that the promotion letter awaiting those signatures from upstairs would need to pass my desk before anyone else's. That his career advancement now quite literally required my approval. Exactly, he said, mistaking my meaning entirely. It's about seeing the big picture, making the tough calls. Not everyone has that instinct. For a brief moment, the certainty in his eyes wavered, as if he'd glimpsed something unfamiliar behind my smile. But then my mother asked about the pool design he was considering, and the moment passed. No, I agreed, holding his gaze. Not everyone does. As conversation flowed around me, I made a decision. After years of keeping my professional and family lives separate, perhaps it was time for worlds to collide. Not with a dramatic revelation over meatloaf, but with something more fitting, a signature on a letter that would change everything. Later that night, I drove from my parents' suburban home not to the struggling artist's apartment they all imagined, but to my penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The doorman greeted me by name as I entered the lobby with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, a far cry from the ramen-fueled existence Nathan had mocked over dinner. Evening, Miss Lane. Shall I send up your usual nightcap? Thanks, Marcus, but not tonight, I replied, stepping into the private elevator. I have some work to catch up on. As the elevator ascended 30 floors, I kicked off my deliberately scuffed shoes and let out a long breath. The dual life I'd cultivated had served me well for years, but tonight it felt unexpectedly heavy, like a designer coat I'd outgrown, but kept wearing out of habit. Inside my apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a glittering cityscape. I poured myself a glass of 18-year-old Macallan, a small indulgence that cost more than the cheap wine Nathan had teased me about bringing to dinner, and settled into my home office. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than my family imagined. 8 years ago, fresh out of business school, with unconventional ideas about financial technology, I'd co-founded Bytestream with my college roommate, Teresa. We'd out of her garage, surviving on instant coffee and pure stubborn determination, building a platform that streamlined payment processing for small businesses. We'd caught the wave just as digital transactions were exploding. Within 3 years, Bytestream was handling transactions for half the startups in the country, and venture capitalists were circling with increasingly aggressive offers. Then Centauri Tech came calling with a merger proposal that would integrate our technology into their global platform. The negotiations had been brutal, but I'd insisted on 2 non-negotiable terms: a generous buyout for our early investors and employees, and a permanent board seat with voting rights for myself. Teresa had taken her payout and launched a high-profile venture capital fund. Her success splashed across business magazines and tech blogs. I'd chosen a different path, investing quietly and keeping my board role anonymous in all public-facing documents. I opened my laptop and clicked on the encrypted folder labeled Centauri Board. Tomorrow's agenda appeared on screen. And there it was, 3rd item, Executive Appointments Review. Nathan's promotion would be up for final vote. The timing wasn't coincidental. Nathan had joined Centauri shortly after the merger, a mid-level Malagar with obvious ambition. If word had gotten out that his younger sister was suddenly on the board of directors, his career would have been forever tainted by whispers of nepotism. Despite our differences, I hadn't wanted that for him. So I'd maintained my silence, attended board meetings remotely when Nathan was presenting, and recused myself from direct decisions about his department, until now. My phone pinged with an incoming email. The subject line read, "Confidential Executive Appointments Package, April Review." I clicked it open to find the detailed assessment of candidates for senior leadership positions. Nathan's name highlighted at the top of the list. I scrolled through his performance metrics, department achievements, and the glossy leadership profile he'd submitted. On paper, he looked impressive, the kind of rising star any corporation would want to fast-track. But I also knew what wasn't in the report. How he took credit for his team's ideas, how he'd pushed out a female colleague who challenged him too often, how his visionary leadership consisted mainly of repackaging other people's innovations with slicker presentations. The penthouse suddenly felt too quiet, too removed from the reality I'd left behind at my parents' dining table. I walked to the window, watching the city lights blur through my reflection. When had this division started? When had I begun seeing my brother not as the playmate who'd taught me to ride a bike, but as the man who derived pleasure from believing I was struggling? Perhaps it was when I'd excitedly shown him my business plan for Bytestream, and he'd patted my head with condescending amusement. "Cute idea, Harper, but leave the real business to people who understand the market." Or maybe it was 3 Christmases ago, when he'd given me a self-help book called From Passion to Profit, Turning Your Hobby into a Career, with a note saying, "Thought this might help. Not everyone can handle the corporate ladder." The board vote would be split. I'd seen the preliminary positions. My signature could make or break his promotion. For the first time in years, I held direct power over my brother's future, and he had no idea. I returned to my desk and typed a brief email to the board chair. "Regarding tomorrow's executive appointments vote, I will attend in person rather than by proxy. Please ensure my name appears on any appointment letters resulting from this decision." It was an unusual request, but not unheard of. Board members occasionally signed such documents personally when they wanted to signal strong support for a strategic appointment. The chair's response came quickly. "Noted, Harper. We look forward to seeing you in the boardroom." I closed my laptop, the decision crystallizing like ice in my veins. Tomorrow, I would vote on my brother's promotion based solely on his professional merits, divorced from our personal history. But for the first time, I would ensure he knew exactly who had the final say in his ascent up that corporate ladder he so revered. The realization brought not vindication, but a strange, hollow feeling. I'd built this secret empire partly to prove Nathan wrong, to succeed on my own terms without his approval or knowledge. Yet here I was, still defined by his perception, still measuring my worth against his dismissal. Tomorrow would change that. One way or another, the power balance that had silently shaped our relationship for years would finally be exposed. And Nathan would have to reconcile the sister he'd mocked at dinner with the board member who held his career in her hands. The question was, would I give him what he wanted or what he deserved? The Centauri boardroom exuded the sterile power that came with corporate success, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic city views, a massive table of polished mahogany, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Board members filed in with their leather portfolios and quiet conversations about market forecasts and quarterly projections. I deliberately arrived early, choosing a seat that wouldn't immediately draw attention. My outfit, a simple charcoal suit that whispered quality rather than shouted it, was designed to blend in rather than stand out. For 6 years, I'd perfected the art of being forgettable in these meetings, speaking only when necessary, attending remotely whenever possible. Today was different. "Harper, what a pleasant surprise," said Julian Phillips, Centauri's CEO, extending his hand. "I believe this is the first time you've graced us with your physical presence this fiscal year." "Some matters warrant personal attention," I replied with a small smile. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Indeed. Well, we've got a full agenda. The executive appointments should come up after the quarterly review." I nodded, accepting the thick folder from his assistant. Inside was everything the board needed to evaluate the candidates for senior leadership positions, performance metrics, leadership assessments, strategic vision statements. And there, on top, was my brother's file marked with a gold star indicating the selection committee's highest recommendation. As the meeting progressed through budget approvals and market expansion strategies, I studied Nathan's promotion package. His technical qualifications were undeniable: consistent growth in his department, successful product launches, glowing reviews from most of his peers. But buried in the appendices were the warning signs that the selection committee had conveniently minimized. 2 formal complaints from female team members about Nathan taking credit for their work. a troubling pattern of high turnover among creative staff in his division. Anonymous feedback describing him as brilliant but intimidating and dismissive of junior contributors. Classic Nathan, positioning himself to shine while leaving scorched earth behind him. Then there was his strategic proposal for Asian market expansion, the cornerstone of his VP application. I'd seen better analysis in undergraduate business courses. The research was superficial, the cultural considerations non-existent, and the financial projections optimistic to the point of fantasy. It had all the hallmarks of something thrown together at the last minute by someone convinced of their own brilliance. Moving on to executive appointments, Phillips announced, pulling me from my thoughts. We have 4 senior positions to confirm today, but I'd like to focus first on the VP of Strategy role. As you can see from the materials, the selection committee strongly recommends Nathan Lane for this position. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Nathan had always been good at making powerful allies. His quarterly results speak for themselves, said Thomas Whitmore, the board's oldest member. Consistent growth, even during market contractions. Impressive. And his team seems very dedicated, added Rebecca Chen, glancing at the performance metrics. Low absenteeism, high productivity. I cleared my throat softly. I'd like to draw the board's attention to Appendix C, regarding departmental turnover. Folders rustled as members flipped to the relevant section. 37% turnover in junior and mid-level positions over 18 months, I noted. Significantly above company average. Phillips frowned. Staff churn is sometimes the price of high performance, Harper. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But when combined with the feedback patterns in Appendix D and the 2 formal prompom referenced in the HR summary, it suggests a leadership style that may not scale well to the vice presidential level. Rebecca Chen studied the documents more carefully now. There does seem to be a pattern here. Takes credit for team ideas appears multiple times in the anonymous feedback. Many visionaries are difficult to work with, Whitmore countered. Jobs wasn't known for his gentle management style, but Apple didn't suffer for it. Jobs changed the world, I replied evenly. This proposal for Asian market expansion barely changes the conversation. The cultural research is superficial at best, and the financial projections ignore 3 major regional competitors. A subtle shift occurred around the table, board members re-examining the materials, reconsidering their initial impressions. This was dangerous territory. I hadn't intended to actively undermine Nathan's promotion, only to ensure it wasn't rubber-stamped without proper scrutiny. Well, Phillips said after an uncomfortable silence, these are valid concerns. But Nathan's overall performance metrics remain exceptional. Perhaps we should move to a vote. The initial show of hands revealed exactly what I'd anticipated, a perfect split. 3 votes in favor, 3 against, with my vote as the tiebreaker. All eyes turned to me. In that moment, I saw not the boardroom but my parents' dining table. Nathan's smug smile as he offered me an entry-level position, the casual cruelty of his mockery, the years of dismissing my choices while flaunting his success. I saw the brother who had never once asked about my work with genuine interest, who had defined his worth by believing in my failure. Ms. Lane, Phillips prompted. Your vote will decide. I thought of the person Nathan could become, either humbled by having his weaknesses exposed, or further emboldened by unearned advancement. I thought of the teams that would serve under him, the ideas he would claim, the careers he might stifle or nurture depending on the lesson he learned today. I vote yes, I said finally, with conditions. Phillips raised an eyebrow. Conditions? First, mandatory leadership coaching focusing on collaborative management and appropriate credit attribution. Second, a revised Asian market strategy that addresses the cultural and competitive gaps before any resources are allocated. Third, I paused, considering my final condition carefully. I want my signature on his appointment letter. Your signature? Whitmore looked confused. That's highly unusual for a board member who isn't the chair. It's important to me, I said simply. Phillips studied me for a long moment, perhaps sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify. Very well. The board approves Nathan Lane's promotion to VP of Strategy, subject to the conditions specified by Director Lane. The appointment letter will bear her signature alongside mine. As the meeting moved on to other candidates, I felt neither triumph nor guilt, but a strange sense of inevitability. as if two trains that had been traveling on separate tracks for years were finally approaching their collision point. The letter would be delivered to Nathan's office tomorrow. By this time next week, everything would change. I only hoped I was making the right choice, not just for myself or even for Nathan, but for all the people who would be affected by the man my brother might become. The week after the board meeting passed in a blur of anticipation, I checked my phone obsessively for calls or texts from Nathan, but none came. The promotion letter had been delivered to his office on Wednesday. I'd confirmed with Phillips's assistant, yet the explosion I'd been bracing for hadn't materialized. The silence was more unnerving than any confrontation. By Saturday, my parents' weekly dinner invitation arrived as usual. This time with a special note. Nathan has some exciting news to share. Apparently, my brother hadn't connected the dots yet. Or perhaps he was saving his reaction for a more public setting. Either way, I would soon find out. This time, I arrived at my parents' house deliberately early, parking my Honda directly behind my father's car so Nathan would have to acknowledge my presence. I'd chosen my outfit with care, not the carefully cultivated struggling artist look, but not boardroom attire either. Just a simple blouse and well-fitted jeans that suggested quiet confidence rather than financial strain. My mother answered the door with flour-dusted hands and a beaming smile. "Harper, you're early for once? Come help me with the appetizers." In the kitchen, I arranged cheese and crackers while my mother babbled excitedly about Nathan's promotion. "He called your father first thing Thursday morning. Absolutely over the moon. They're giving him a corner office with a view of the harbor." "That's wonderful," I said, feeling a strange pang of something like disappointment. Had Nathan truly not seen my signature, or was he simply choosing to ignore it? And the salary increase? I mean, he didn't give us specifics, but he mentioned a signing bonus that would cover a European vacation for him and Elise. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I think they might be planning to start a family soon. Can you imagine? You could be an aunt by next year." The thought of Nathan reproducing, creating another human he could mold in his image, sent a chill through me. I pushed it aside and focused on arranging olives in a perfect spiral. My father appeared in the doorway, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Harper," he nodded. "Didn't realize you were here already." There was something different in his manner, a hesitancy that hadn't been there before. He studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Dad," I acknowledged. "Heard the good news about Nathan." "Yes?" he said slowly. "Quite an achievement." The doorbell rang, preventing further conversation. My father disappeared to answer it, and moments later, Nathan's booming voice filled the entryway. "Hope you've got the good wine chilling. This calls for proper celebration." I steeled myself and carried the appetizer tray into the living room. Nathan stood in the center, arm around Elise, holding court as usual. He'd gone full corporate success story today. Designer polo, expensive watch prominently displayed, hair freshly cut. Elise wore a new dress with the price tag's shadow still visible on the fabric, where she'd recently removed it. Nathan's eyes found mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. Confusion, perhaps, or the faintest flicker of uncertainty before his trademark confidence reasserted itself. "Well, if it isn't my favorite sister," he announced, voice booming. "Come to bask in the family glory? Congratulations on the promotion," I said simply. "VP of Strategy. Impressive." "Official as of Thursday," he confirmed, chest puffing slightly. "Corner office. Executive bathroom key, the works." I nodded, watching his face carefully. "The board must have been impressed with your proposal." "Unanimous decision," he replied without hesitation. "Philip said my Asian market strategy sealed the deal." The lie slipped out so easily, so confidently, that I almost doubted my own memory of the board meeting. Had Nathan been told the vote was unanimous, or was this his own embellishment? "That's not how board votes usually work," I said mildly. "Typically there's some discussion, concerns raised, conditions set." Nathan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Speaking from experience, are we?" Our mother bustled in, oblivious to the tension. "Dinner's almost ready. Nathan, tell Harper about your new office." As the evening progressed, Nathan dominated the conversation with increasingly grandiose descriptions of his new role, the team he'd be building, the budget he'd control, the executive retreat in Aspen next month. With each boast, his glances toward me grew more pointed, more challenging, as if daring me to contradict him. Actually, he said, swirling his wine with theatrical precision, I'll be hiring a new creative director soon. Someone who can translate our technical vision into language the average consumer can understand. He looked directly at me. You know, Harper, if you ever get tired of the starving artist routine, I could probably find a spot for you in my department. Entry level, of course, but it would be a foot in the door. A real job. The same offer he'd made last week. Delivered with the same condescending smile. But this time, with the knowledge of my signature somewhere in his onboarding paperwork, it felt different, like a test or perhaps a trap. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Nathan, I'm sure your sister is doing fine with her work. Of course she is, Nathan replied with exaggerated sincerity. But there's fine, and then there's thriving. Not everyone has the instinct for success. I caught my father watching me with that same strange expression from earlier, as if seeing me for the first time or perhaps seeing through me. Instinct can be overrated, I said quietly. Sometimes success is about what you know, not what others think you know. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, meaning, nothing, I smiled, raising my glass. Just that appearances can be deceiving. Congratulations again on the promotion, Nathan. I hope it brings you everything you deserve. As we clinked glasses, I saw it again, that flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he'd caught the double edge in my words but couldn't quite place its source. The collision I'd been anticipating was still coming, but it was approaching more slowly, more subtly than I'd expected. I glanced at my father, who was watching our exchange with unusual intensity. For a moment, our eyes met, and I realized with sudden clarity, he knew something. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to question the narrative Nathan had constructed. The game had changed, and I wasn't the only one who sensed it. Monday morning found Nathan striding through Centauri's glass headquarters with the confidence of a man who believed the universe was finally giving him his due. His weekend had been a victory lap. First, the family dinner where he'd reminded Harper of her place in the hierarchy. Then a celebratory evening with friends at an exclusive restaurant where he'd insisted on ordering bottles that cost more than most people's car payments. His new office, the coveted corner suite on the executive floor, was already being prepared. Maintenance staff had been painting all weekend, and the custom desk he'd selected would arrive by Wednesday. For now, he'd work from his old office one last time, savoring the transition. "Morning, Mr. Lane," his assistant Jennifer greeted him with a careful smile. "Congratulations on the promotion."
Thank you, Jennifer.
He replied magnanimously. "You'll be moving up with me, of course. Can't navigate the executive level without proper support." The relief on her face was palpable. "Thank you, sir. HR sent over your official paperwork this morning. Said you need to sign everything before your new access credentials can be issued." Perfect timing, Nathan grinned, accepting the thick envelope she handed him. "Hold my calls for the next hour. I've got some calls to make to the Singapore office about my market expansion plan." Alone in his office, Nathan tore open the envelope with the satisfied air of a man opening a long-awaited gift. The Centauri letterhead gleamed at the top of the first page, followed by paragraphs of corporate congratulations on his appointment to Vice President of Strategic Operations. He skimmed the text, eyes jumping ahead to the compensation details, the six-figure salary adjustment, the stock options, the performance bonuses, all exactly as he'd negotiated. Even the housing allowance he'd added as a last-minute demand. Phillips had clearly recognized his value. At the bottom of the second page was a note about the leadership coaching sessions, scheduled to begin next month. Nathan frowned slightly. He hadn't discussed any coaching. Probably just standard executive onboarding, he decided, flipping to the signature page. Phillips's elaborate signature appeared at the top, followed by the board chair's more restrained mark. Nathan's eyes drifted downward, ready to find the signature line where he'd affirm his acceptance of the position. Instead, his gaze locked on a third signature under board approval. "Harper Lane, board member." Nathan blinked, certain he was misreading. He looked again. Harper Lane. His sister's name in her unmistakable handwriting. The same slight slant to the right, the distinctive lope on the capital H that had always reminded him of their mother's script. "What the hell?" he muttered, flipping back to the first page to check the letterhead. Everything seemed in order. This wasn't a prank. With trembling fingers, he grabbed his phone and dialed Phillips's direct line. "Nathan, congratulations again. Ready to join the executive ranks?" Phillips sounded genuinely pleased. "Thank you, sir. I just received my formal offer letter, and I noticed something unusual on the signature page." "Unusual? Everything should be in order. The board approved your appointment on Thursday." Nathan swallowed hard. "Yes, about that. There's a signature from a Harper Lane listed as a board member. Is this some kind of clerical error?" The pause that followed lasted just long enough to confirm Nathan's growing dread. "No error," Phillips finally said, his tone careful. "Harper Lane has been on our board since the ByteStream acquisition 5 years ago. As a major stakeholder from that merger, she holds a permanent board seat." Nathan felt the floor tilt beneath him. "ByteStream? The payment processing platform?" "The very same. Ms. Lane was co-founder and chief innovation officer before we acquired them. Brilliant strategist, actually. Her insights on the Asian markets were particularly valuable during your promotion deliberations." The room seemed suddenly airless. "And this Harper Lane, she's my sister?" Another pause. "I was under the impression you knew. She recused herself from votes involving your department for years, citing a personal connection, though she never specified the nature of that connection. This was the first time she's directly voted on your advancement." Nathan ended the call with mechanical pleasantries, his mind racing. 5 years. His sister had been watching his career from the boardroom for 5 years. Every presentation he'd given, every proposal he'd submitted, every accomplishment he'd claimed, Harper had been there, silently observing from her hidden position of power. And all the while, he'd been mocking her at family gatherings, pitying her imagined financial struggles, offering her entry-level positions in his department. His stomach lurched as a new thought struck him. The leadership coaching requirement in his promotion package that hadn't come from Phillips, the revised Asian market strategy he'd been ordered to develop before any resources would be allocated. Those weren't standard conditions. Those were Harper's conditions. With shaking hands, he pulled up the company directory on his computer and searched for Lane Harper. No results. Of course, she would have insisted on privacy. He tried another approach, searching the board member profiles on the company's internal site. There she was, a minimal profile with no photo, listing only H. Lane with a brief description. Board member, ByteStream acquisition representative. Areas of expertise: financial technology, market strategy, international expansion. Nathan sat back in his chair, the magnitude of his misunderstanding crashing over him in waves. His little sister wasn't a struggling artist. She was his superior in the corporate hierarchy he'd built his identity around. She hadn't needed his pity or his entry-level job offers. She had been, quite literally, signing off on his career advancement. And now, with this promotion, she had made sure he knew it. He grabbed his phone again and dialed Harper's number. The call went straight to voicemail, just as it had the dozen times he'd called her with minor emergencies or to boast about work achievements. "Harper," he began, then stopped, unsure what to say. The anger, humiliation, and concern swirled together into a knot in his throat. "We need to talk," he finally managed. "About the promotion. About Centauri. About everything." He hung up, staring at the signature page before him. His sister's name seemed to grow larger on the page, the only thing in focus, as the rest of his carefully constructed world blurred around the edges. The office he'd been so proud of moments ago suddenly felt small, the victory he'd been savoring now tasting like ash in his mouth. Everything he thought he knew about Harper, about his own success, about his place in the world, had been built on a foundation of assumptions that had just crumbled beneath him. And the worst part wasn't that Harper had hidden her success all these years. It was that she had finally revealed it in the one way he couldn't possibly ignore. The week following Nathan's discovery passed in silence. I received his voicemail but chose not to return it. This confrontation needed to happen in person, not over a phone call where either of us could retreat too easily. Sunday dinner would come soon enough. When I arrived at my parents' home that weekend, I drove my own car, not the Honda Civic I'd been using for family visits, but the Tesla I actually drove daily. I wore clothes that weren't ostentatious but were undeniably well-made. Small changes but meaningful ones. I was done with pretending. My father answered the door, his eyebrows rising slightly at my appearance. "New car?" he asked, glancing past me to the driveway. "Old car, actually. I replied. Just not the one you're used to seeing. He studied me for a moment, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. Nathan's already here. Been quiet all evening. In the living room, my mother was arranging flowers while chatting with Elise, who smiled at me with her usual polite emptiness. And there was Nathan, standing by the window with a glass of scotch, looking like he hadn't slept properly in days. When he saw me, his face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and finally a careful neutrality. "Harper," he said, his voice oddly formal. "Nathan," I replied, accepting a glass of wine from my father. "How's the new office?" Something flashed in his eyes, a wounded pride perhaps, or the realization that I knew exactly how his week had gone. "Still being set up," he answered stiffly. Dinner was a masterclass in awkward silence. My mother attempted to fill the void with questions about Nathan's promotion, oblivious to the tension crackling between us. "They're putting you in charge of the Asian expansion, right?" she asked brightly. "That sounds so important." Nathan's knuckles whitened around his fork. "The strategy is still being refined," he said carefully.
Oh, I thought you said it was all approved last week?
"Board requested some revisions," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. My father watched this exchange with quiet attention, his gaze moving between us. "Boards can be demanding," he observed. "They often see angles that even the best executives miss." Nathan shot him a look of surprise, then understanding. "You know," he said softly. My father shrugged. "I suspected. The timing was too convenient. And Harper has never been as transparent as she thinks." My mother looked between us, confusion clouding her features. "What are you all talking about?" "Nothing, Mom," Nathan and I said simultaneously, then glanced at each other in shared discomfort at the rare moment of unity. After dinner, I slipped out to the back porch for air. The spring evening was cool, stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I heard the door open behind me and knew without turning that it was Nathan. He stood beside me at the railing, staring into the backyard where we'd played as children. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. "5 years, he finally said, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "You've been on that board for 5 years." I nodded. "Since the merger." "Why didn't you tell me?" The question contained too many emotions to name: hurt, confusion, embarrassment, anger. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked. "Would you have seen me differently if you'd known I had money and influence?" His silence was answer enough. "I wanted to be respected for who I am," I continued quietly, "not what I have. But you never saw past your own assumptions." So this was what? Revenge. Making me look like a fool, having me brag about a promotion you could have blocked at any time. "I approved your promotion because you earned it," I replied evenly. "Your department's metrics are strong, even if your leadership style needs work. The coaching will help with that." He flinched slightly. "Those were your conditions." "Yes. And the signature on the letter? Was that necessary?" I turned to face him directly. "That was for me. After years of listening to you mock my choices and pity my imagined poverty, I needed you to know the truth." The door opened again, and our father stepped out, carrying 3 glasses of his good scotch. He handed one to each of us and kept the third for himself. "Your mother's confused," he said, "but I convinced her to give us a few minutes." Nathan took a large swallow of his drink. "Did you know all along?" Our father shook his head. "Not until recently. I noticed things, little inconsistencies in Harper's story. The way she talked about business concepts no struggling artist would know." He looked at me with something like respect. "I knew there was more to you than you were showing us. I just didn't realize how much more." I raised my glass slightly. "I'm not broke, Dad. I just don't flaunt it." "Why the charade, though?" Nathan asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why drive a beat-up car to family dinners? Why let us think you were barely getting by?" "At first, it was to protect your ego," I admitted. "If everyone knew I'd co-founded ByteStream and joined Centauri's board while you were still in middle management, every promotion you got would be tainted by whispers of nepotism." Nathan blinked, clearly never having considered this angle. And then, I continued, it just became easier than correcting assumptions. Everyone had their narrative: Harper the dreamer, Nathan the achiever. Changing that seemed complicated. "Until now," he said quietly. "Until now," I agreed. We stood in silence, the weight of years of misunderstanding hanging between us. Finally, Nathan cleared his throat. "The Asian market proposal," he said hesitantly. "What was wrong with it? Specifically?" The question surprised me. No defensiveness, no accusations, just a genuine inquiry. For the first time in our adult lives, my brother was asking for my professional opinion. "Cultural context was missing," I replied honestly. "And you underestimated regional payment preferences. The success metrics were also too aggressive for a first-phase launch." He nodded slowly, processing this. "I have to submit the revision by Friday. Would you be willing to look at it first, not as a board member, as someone who knows the space?" It wasn't an apology, but from Nathan, this acknowledgement of my expertise was perhaps as close as he could manage. "Send it over," I said. "I'll make time." As we walked back inside to join the rest of the family, something fundamental had shifted between us. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for years had been exposed and rebalanced. Nathan's perception of me, and of himself, had been permanently altered. He never mocked me at family gatherings again, and every board decision that affected his career from that point forward carried a signature he couldn't ignore, not because I wielded my influence against him, but because we both now understood the true balance between us. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't a grand revelation or a moment of triumph. Sometimes it's simply letting the truth speak for itself.